Christopher, why did you decide to write Who's Who in Grunty Fen?
I've got a very important message in the answer. I've spent most of my life as a journalist, which is 61 years now, writing about people who think they're famous and shouldn't be, in my opinion. I've interviewed sports stars and flimsy starlets with no talent at all, and politicians who can't make a speech without reading the notes. And I thought there's got to be something better than all these stupid non-celebrities that have made themselves famous for nothing. And so I thought, let's get down to the grassroots. Let's find out whether real people in real places doing real things have been neglected, and there are the real celebrities, the real stars. And so I started digging around, not just Grunty Fen. I went beyond that, and I took on almost the whole of the Fens. And Carol, I can remember my first discoveries. I was astonished at what I found. Almost, Grunty Fen dogs are not to be trusted, you know. They come up and they sniff round your ankles and then they bite them. Anyway, no matter. August Burton. Now there's a name. It does sound a pretty impressive name, actually, but he had a very undistinguished origin. Just ordinary tradespeople living in some shabby circumstance out in one of the Fen villages. And yet his name really should go down, well, in history. In a sense, I've made that happen, this little history. He explored the Fens thoroughly for the first time. And he discovered many villages which nobody had suspected. It was like going into darkest Africa. And he found villages where people were following customs that nobody had dreamed of. The sad thing is that he did leave a pretty good account of most of the communities that he encountered on his forays into the Fens. He wrote a book called A Foot on the Fens, far afield, a foot on the Fens. It was very full of F's. Anyway, he found many villages and made a good record of them. And as I said, there was a sadness to this, because so many of them have been, well, you know what happens. I can't think of any way to put it more politely. They have been sucked back in. The surface of the Fen is not to be trusted. It is oozing with past civilizations, and sometimes it regurgitates and a Fen village reappears after a century or two, and others simply vanish. One has no way of knowing what layers of villages there are under the surface of a Fen field. Anyway, he pinned down many of them. Antoinette Claydon is another woman, and I have to be careful what I say here because she's still alive. She is a true heroine of Fen culture. She came originally from Putney in South London, and she has a minor inheritance. Her father was a tobacconist, and it doesn't matter. And the best value for money she could get in terms of real estate was to buy a house at Grunty Fen, as a matter of fact. And her ambition was to civilise the Fens. Now, as this little book will make clear, there's a good many people who have tried to civilise the Fens, and this is a feat yet to be fully achieved. She wanted to do it by providing reading matter. The county library had failed dreadfully. It wasn't their fault, but you see, I can't put this without sounding critical of the good people of the Fens. But look, not to beat about the bush, they burned the books. If the county library provided a full range of novels and factual volumes, in cold weather people rushed into the library and the books were never seen again. I mean, that's the plain truth of it. She thought she could rescue the situation by inviting people to contribute their own books. And yeah, well, I don't think I'll tell you the outcome because I want you to read the book. But Antoinette Claydon is who was that wonderful man, the architect?
Niven Parr.
Niven Parr. Now, Niven Parr, once again, I must not, as if I'd want to, say anything adverse about Niven Parr. He's still alive and still doing wonderful work out on the Fens. Anybody with an idle moment, a couple of hours, to take a spin across the seemingly uneventful flat fields of the Fens may well see his finest work. If you come across a curious construction, a habitation, a hut, a barn, a pigsty, and it is of a classical nature, you will see columns in the Corinthian, Ionic or Doric order. You may see something Rococo, Baroque. These are his work. He has produced a synthesis of Western architecture. No, I correct myself, because there is a strong Chinese influence in some of his work. So Oriental and Occidental architecture is brought together in the pigsties of the Fens. You've got to read. You really must read about Niven if you want to understand the true story of English architecture in the 20th and early 21st century.
How many people did you bring to light, let's say, from the bleakness of Grunty Fen?
Well, and of course the villages in the hinterland as it comes and goes over the centuries. Many more than are in the book, my dear. Many more. I've had to set aside some noble people. Quite frankly, I could only really tell the truth about some of the people I've discovered. One must wait for, well, quite frankly, the Grim Reaper to, as it were, release one's pen in order to. I won't say any more about that. So I can't say I'm hoping, but I am expecting that in the course of time I may be free to tell the stories of some of the other people I've discovered. So at the moment it's a mere handful. As I say in the introduction to this modest volume, which is really a work in progress, do you know when the Hubble telescope was turned to a little blank bit of sky, and the astronomers were astonished to discover that it was full of undreamed of and otherwise invisible galaxies. And it's the same with the Fens. If you just turn your telescope, it almost needs no focusing. There was a dog. Do you remember Susan the dog? Have you read about Susan the dog? Amazing. A clergyman who, and the history of the clergy of Grunty Fen and neighbouring villages is not an entirely happy one. And in this case, the gentleman had read about the wonderful work of the big sheepdogs, the St. Bernards, who rescue stray people lost in the awful snowy wastes of the Alps. And he wanted to do the same thing, but he didn't think that sending dogs out across the Fens, where many people do fall into dreadful peril in swamps and bogs, because as you know, I've told you before, one of the many perils of the swamps and bogs on the Fens, even the puddles, is that they are deeper at the sides than in the middle. So people believe that they can sort of walk around the edge. Oh no, it's better to go for the middle. Anyway, so many people come into trouble on the Fens, and in his time even more, because of course the light was less available. The hand torch hadn't been invented. So he thought he would put dogs out on the Fen, trained dogs with not alcohol, which he was opposed to, round their necks, but he thought something that was more traditional as a sustenance for people who were hungry, exhausted and lost, would be meat pasties. So he had a way of attaching pasties to the dogs, who would then send out to look for the lost. Well, you can guess the outcome, can't you? I mean, the dogs ate the pasties. So he got round that by tying the pasties to the back of the dogs' necks, so that they couldn't get at the pasties that they were carrying for the lost voyagers. Unfortunately, other dogs... Look, I won't tell the whole story, but you can guess what happened with that one. It's not a happy story. Some of the stories really do rather touching. The lady who, during the war, devoted herself to knitting parachutes for our brave airmen. And nobody knew who she was, do you see, because she would appeal for knitting materials, saying it was for the war effort. without telling people what particular effort she was making. And having knitted the parachutes, she used to take them to RAF and USAF stations all around and simply leave them at the gate with no note identifying her. And she did this, so far as we can tell, for 4 years. She gave up her job in the haberdashery department at an Ely store, and she devoted herself to knitting parachutes. Nobody ever told her the problem with a knitted parachute, and alas, it's a sad story. Even now I feel rather affected by the poor lady. But there are many sad stories. The vicar who tried to translate the Bible into Grunt, the local language, he was quite convinced, and he may be right, that the way people talk on the Fens is not a product, it's not a dialect of English or some other language. It is a tongue sui generis. It is Grunt. The language of the Fens is Grunt. And he managed to write, he began a vocabulary of it, and he managed several words, but he died, alas, and he died in a garret, having gone a little bit dotty, I suppose is the word you have to use, and it was very cold, and his landlady warmed him up by burning the... Oh, I can't bring myself to tell you about it.
Well, the cold, I think, has got the better of us this time. I'd just like to say...
It's chilly, isn't it?
It is. Yes. Thank you very much, Christopher.
It's nice of you to have invited me to this hut.
That's quite all right. And I have to say that... thank you to the Gladlen for putting on their extractor fan from the kitchen, which has blown through the hut rather successfully.
Is this the Gladlen restaurant?
It's round the back of the Gladlen.
Oh, I thought it was just a hut.
No, it's
a restaurant.
It's actually the peeling shed where they peel the potatoes.
I thought I could smell something.
Well, so did I.
And what is that scurrying noise in the peeling?
We'll draw.
Yes, I think yes.
We'll draw a veil over that and say thank you very much.
More than a veil, my love.
Thank you very much, Christopher South. And we look forward to many more characters coming from your pen once it is allowed to flow.
When they're dead.